As much as I talk about the value and the benefits of having and doing a personal project, I can say that certain mindsets and habits from personal projects did make me struggle as a first-time story artist within the animation industry, to the point where it caused problems and I had to be pulled out from certain productions. My journey as a new story artist in the animation industry was not smooth at all. I actually struggled, and today I'd like to talk about that. Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about a few things. The hardest lesson I learned when I started my first full-time job at DreamWorks Animation, and my first few years in the animation industry. I actually struggled. There were times where I nearly got fired, and there were times I got let go because I wasn't really seen as a priority to keep around in a studio. Especially when animation studios were going through a purge where they had to let go a lot of people. Now, one could say it's studio politics, it's beyond my reach, it's beyond my control, it has nothing to do with me, but there was a small part where it was due to my performance. Now, in this channel, I've always talked about the value of a personal project and always having to work on something outside of your main work, your full-time job, or whatever. And of course, there's a reason why I'm bringing this up, and there's a good reason why I don't treat my personal projects like I do for studio work that I do for actual companies. I work primarily as a storyboard artist, but let me show you guys my storyboard work for my own personal projects, and they're really janky, and when I put them next to storyboards that I do for feature films for actual studios, the quality is vastly different. The drawings are a bit more fleshed out, there's a bit of tone here and there, and the characters may be a bit more on model, and there's a lot more poses, there's a lot more acting in the characters. Here's another example. So when I'm doing personal projects or projects that I'm doing by myself, my rough animation tends to be more limited. Drawings hold for much longer because when I go for cleanup, that's when I start smoothing things out. That's when I add more in-betweens. However, for actual studio work, I try to submit the best version of the rough animation that I can. Things are more fully in between. The drawings are a lot more solid. I try to keep the drawings as tight as possible, nothing too loose, and so that cleanup and color have all the info they need to help them in their job. Now, personally, there's nothing wrong with these two approaches. It really depends on the situation, the circumstance, and the production that you're in. There's a few productions that don't mind me boarding like I do for my personal projects, which are just more like suggestions, very loose, very crudely drawn, and very janky. But the problem was that I was boarding like that in a studio where they wanted me to board more fleshed out. Now, my history is that I've made a few short films, I've done some independent projects, personal projects. I see myself more as an independent creator than a professional in the studio environment. So with that being said, I've tapped on many different stages of the production, ranging from storyboarding to animation to coloring to backgrounds, etc. So I kind of had to be a jack of all trades. But, you know, because of time constraints and limitations, I also had an idea of what to prioritize. And if time was such a huge constraint in a personal project, you either had to sacrifice a lot or just keep moving forward no matter what. And this kind of workflow might lead to the whole fix it later kind of mindset. Or for example, you do storyboards, it's not fully fleshed out, the staging is not super final, and you just go, oh, you know what, I'm gonna figure out an animation. And in the animation stage, you start figuring out the layout, how many shots you actually need, etc. Then you move on to backgrounds and you're like, oh, you know what, I'll just like reuse some backgrounds here and there. And of course, there's a joy to that, but it doesn't really work in a studio environment. Now, when I got offered my first full-time job at DreamWorks Animation, it felt like I made it. I didn't really need to think too hard about it. It was just storyboarding. I'm familiar with storyboarding, so this shouldn't be difficult, right? Well, there's a reason studios and productions tend to hire people for specific disciplines and positions. An artist could be a character designer and another artist could work as a storyboard artist. In most major studios, they're not really looking for a person who can do every stage or every discipline. And you know what? There's a lot of people in the industry who's never made a short film or made their own little project. They were just storyboard artists or character designers. But there were artists who had multiple disciplines and skills where they could jump in between different roles. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I was treating a full-time studio production, the way I would board it was that I was treating it as a project that I was making in my little living room. And there's a few things that I'd like to point out that actually made me really struggle in this regard. So the first one was something that I mentioned earlier, which was the fix it later mindset. It's the whole idea of playing things by ear, just moving forward no matter what, prioritizing things later on in the process. You know, when I talk about my past experiences, I always fix things later in the production. So for example, one of my student films, Wolf Song, actually had dialogue. We recorded the dialogue, the wolf and the boy actually talked to each other like a folktale. A month before the film was due, I decided to remove all the dialogue and just reset to just pantomime acting. This was something that I decided later on in the post-production stage. So when I was doing storyboards for major productions, I had the idea that they were going to just fix it later on in previs, in the layout stage, in character design, in set design. So I made my board super loose, super janky, and flat. And of course, this is not a mindset that you should have when going into a full-time production. Basically, you're just being hired to make work and then later on have someone else fix your crap. And that's extra cost and time for the production. And the whole fix it later mindset does not work in a major production with multiple people and multiple stages. So when I was working on the Adventures of Puss in Boots for DreamWorks TV, my boards got sent back because the proportions were off, the characters did not match the proportions according to each other, so it made the animation team and the vendor studio struggle too. So I just made it harder for everyone. And even if you're the most compliant artist, you're the nicest artist, but you make it harder for everyone, that's an easy way to get let go or fired from a production. Now, while I do think that there is some value to the whole fix it later methodology or mindset, I would not go into a studio thinking and having that mindset, even if your role is just a small part or a small gear in the machine. So my advice for something like this is to make work that they can actually use in the production, or do work that actually solves many problems or makes the jobs easier for everyone later down the line. Second, the way I approached things in my early career life was based on how I would do things rather than how a production would do it, which saying that can kind of sound selfish. So there was one instance where a board artist had to take out a tumbleweed in their scene because the production limited on how long it would take for them to model a tumbleweed, how much that would cost the production. But in my head, I'm like thinking, dude, just have a transparent image of a tumbleweed silhouette and just have it roll around the screen using After Effects. But you know what? Maybe the production doesn't use After Effects. Maybe that's out of their line, out of their pipeline. While I can suggest something like that, I can't really force it. So my advice for something like this is just constantly ask a question about the pipeline, what is needed, what they're expecting, what autonomy they have, what they can or cannot do. You can suggest things, you can even show how things can be done, you can do a demo, but ultimately that's really up to them. And I'm talking specifically about my role as a story artist. So the way I do my storyboards, I'm thinking that it can actually be put into an animatic and an editor can use those panels for a screening. In feature animation, you don't always have to match the model sheets of the design. Sometimes storyboarding and character design go in conjunction, but one of the biggest notes that I got as a feature board artist was to match the tone, the mood, and the theme of the production. So if I had to board something that was serious and dramatic, my boards were looking more like it belonged in a sitcom comedy. In feature animation boarding, acting, the performance, and shot choices play a huge role. Now, the biggest notes that I got for TV storyboards when I was early on in my career, I didn't match the character size references to each other, the staging was off, things were flat, and in TV, they want things a bit more tied down, the drawing's a bit more on model, especially if it's a 2D production, whereas I was just boarding lollipop heads. And again, my initial approach was because I came from a personal project short film mindset, and I actually tried to justify this approach because I always thought I wanted to give autonomy to the animators, the designers, the layout artists, or the previs artists. But at the end of the day, a job is a job. So during my first few years as a story artist in the animation industry, I was starting to realize a pattern. I was getting let go, I didn't stay too long on the production, and I was constantly moving around, and I always thought, oh, it was just like studio formalities. It's just show business. But then there was one production where I was the only one let go, and I was told that they were starting to let go half of their story team because they were trying to shrink down the team. But I later found out that I was the only one that was let go, and they brought in newer artists in. And it wasn't until like months later where I was in a Thanksgiving party where a coworker told me that I was let go because the producer did not like my drawings. And honestly, I wish they told me that when I was there. I think it was also part of their fault for not letting me know on that regard. But then I would also be in denial because I do remember during my time there, I was given subtle notes to change the way how I draw, change the way how I drew expressions. So it was something that I kind of already knew what was happening. And that was when I realized that I had to change my overall approach. That it wasn't really just about how I would work unless I was given that autonomy, but it was more about matching what was expected for a production. Look, as much as I would prefer drawing the Family Guy in a Bishonen style as my preference, I would have to resort to drawing how they are actually portrayed in the TV show. So my experience has taught me a lot about these things, and I have some advice to share. So the first one was given to me by my good friend Rune and a Disney veteran. So once you get hired in a full-time studio, I would request having more check-ins with your supervisors, directors, or whoever you can get in touch with in the production so you can kind of gauge how you're doing, what needs to be improved on, what needs to be worked on, just so that you can keep track on your standing and your overall progress within a studio environment. Just basically opening a room for honesty and discussion. Because I don't want that same thing to happen to me again, like where I was let go and I was told that they were shrinking the team, but I eventually found out from another coworker was that they just did not like the way I drew the characters. And this is also a good way to sort of gauge how you can work well with the production, regardless of whether you're a great artist or how skilled you are. Ask questions, what's needed from you, what's expected from you. Ask if they have a certain preference in the way you work. Because it's also your responsibility to do your part and to monitor that. Now, when it comes down to your own independent personal projects, work however you want, because it's yours. Because honestly, there's still something very special in finding your own footing, the way you work with, the way you solve problems. That space can also be used as a way of experimenting with, your style, your workflow, your voice. But when it comes to a production with multiple people involved and you're not really spearheading anything, you might want to turn a few switches off and to learn how to adapt to a certain production. Because the worst thing that can happen is you come in and having people redo and rework on your stuff, not because of a change of vision, but because there are just problems with what you submitted. And it took me a long time to sort of find this out for myself, why I was struggling in my first few years in the industry. Because I got so used to working in a way that I would normally choose to work in because it's personal projects, I have autonomy over that, and it became a habit where I just didn't know that it did cause problems for a team. Anyways, that's all. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.